Welcome back to another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. I am James Yost, partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Travis York, owner of 3-1 Advisors. Travis, how are you?
I'm doing great today, James. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. We are back with another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Travis, how you doing, man?
Good. How are you, James?
I'm doing well. We're getting hit with another kind of last little bit of winter here down in Atlanta. We got a 19-degree morning this morning. So hopefully everybody had some faucets running and aren't dealing with frozen pipes. So our guest today is Jason Hill. So Jason is the Vice President of Sales and Marketing. He's also a co-owner of Blue Frog. Jason is been in the veterinary industry for 20 years now, Jason. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
20 years. And he runs the team over there. They do phenomenal work on the construction side, design, build, all that fun stuff. We are very excited to be talking to him today about all those things. Jason, welcome to the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Thanks for being here, man.
Awesome. Travis, James, thank you both as well.
Excellent. So let's just get into it. So for our listeners who don't know, I know you guys are out there. You're at a lot of the events. Most people know you. But just for our audience, in case they haven't heard of you, give them a little bit of background on Blue Frog, kind of y'all's history in the vet space, and then maybe a little bit about how you differentiate, because you are a niche contractor and not a general kind of overarching all medical type stuff.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So just a little background on the company. So Blue Frog just had their 20th anniversary in December of 24. And, we have been a design build firm in the medical space for the better part of 15 of those 20 years. And more recently, kind of cut our teeth in the dental space. But the last 12 to 13 years have focused even more in the vet space. So probably 80 to 85% of our work is specific to the veterinary industry.
Wow.
So, and you mentioned, you guys obviously do vet and dental. Maybe talk a little bit about your process, because I feel like that's one of the key differentiators, or what you guys feel like makes you guys different, Jason.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the feedback that we get from clients, the overarching kind of differentiator is because we are design build, we work with a lot of startup doctors or just in general, a lot of doctors that come to us that have a finite amount of money. So when they go to that lender, they know exactly what they have to work with, and we try to work within those parameters. So as opposed to having an architect who is in the people-pleasing business and wants to design them the Taj Mahal, and then they take a set of plans to a contractor that may not be able to execute on those plans based on that budget, we know exactly what we're starting with, and we kind of work backwards from there to make sure that we're designing within that budget, so that there's no surprises, late in the game.
Well, maybe just, again, for our listeners, it will be really helpful. Everybody designs a hospital and everybody builds a hospital. What is a design build contractor, and how does that differ from somebody who is a design bid build?
Yep, absolutely. So we don't self-perform our work, but we do have a lot of relationships all over the Southeast, and that has expanded obviously beyond the Southeast as we continue to do more projects all over the country. But we actually will, if a doctor's comfortable, we'll kind of conceptually put a test fit together, and we'll provide a budget based on that test fit. So if they say, I've got a 2,000 square foot space, for example, we'll put a test fit together based on that. We'll make some minor tweaks based on the doctor's recommendations, and then we'll essentially, start the kind of estimation process. And then our goal, once before we actually sign a contract and do design build work, is to be within 5% of that initial estimate. And so we're kind of hand-holding and guiding the client every step of the way to make sure that we understand that you'd really like to have granite countertops, but do you really need these? Are these functional, and are they necessary in your first generation space? Or could we go with something a little more affordable option and give you an additional exam room or something like that? So we're trying to be mindful of what's going to make them the most efficient and ultimately the most, successful in that first generation space. It's great to have the nice to haves, but we really try to focus on the need to haves.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that. I know we want to get into at some point during this podcast, like efficiencies within the space. So I think we're going to get there at some point. But before we get there, I mean, from my conversations with vets around the country, one of the big things, and this goes way beyond vet, it's just the cost of construction in this country has gotten, it's been challenging ever since the pandemic. So what are you seeing now? Like, are costs still rising? Are you still seeing that kind of pace on the construction side, or have things kind of leveled out?
Yes, definitely. Unfortunately, the prices kind of are what they are, and I would not say that there's been much of a slowdown. I do think with interest rates getting higher more recently, although we've got a little bit of come down a little bit in the last 30 to 60 days. I do think that what we're typically seeing is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 250 a foot for an interior build out, and closer to 450 for a ground up project per foot. So quite a bit higher than what we saw 3 to 5 years ago for sure, and prior to that. But I would say that we are firmly telling doctors if they're doing in a first generation interior build out, you're probably looking right at around 250 a foot.
Yeah.
And how are you seeing that like impact projects, Jason? Because I mean, I don't feel like it was that long ago that we got to like kind of estimate them and ballpark them out at $150 a square foot. Are
Right.
lenders keeping up with you? Is it smaller spaces? Like how is that like impacting somebody who wants to get started? Because we still know there's a bunch of startups happening.
Absolutely. The good news is that the success rate are incredibly high for veterinarians, right? So from a risk standpoint, lenders have certainly pivoted and have been more flexible on lending more doctors money, and that is because that default rate is so incredibly low at less than 1/4 of 1% for veterinarians. And so we have seen, I believe, startups now are going to be pushing upwards of 850,000 to 900,000 now, which is quite a bit higher than what we saw. More recently, it's been maybe like 750 tops, but now we are seeing north of 800, upwards of 900, depending on their qualification levels,
Wow.
which is
So that's
encouraging.
changed quite a bit.
Yes, absolutely.
Talk a little bit about delays, like for a new build, ground up. I mean, obviously these folks are eager to get their practice up and running. They maybe already have, clients and patients reaching out to them. And, the last thing they want to do is be delayed for a construction reason. I mean, obviously, there's some things that are beyond everyone's control, but like, what are the biggest factors that contribute to delays on the construction side? And like, how can they strategize to like help on that front if possible?
Yep, I would say the biggest factors that cause any delays, and this is why we put a lot of time into our design process on the front end, because regretfully, if we are making changes in the field, that can certainly contribute to delays. The biggest issue that we see throughout the process is working with municipalities, because it is a little frustrating because a lot of the municipalities are working remotely, and so you're kind of beholden to a portal to get any kind of update, which makes it a little challenging sometimes to provide updates to doctors. But I would say as you get closer to like major metropolitan areas, the Atlantas, the Charlottes of the world, those regretfully can be a little more challenging sometimes on the front end getting the project in motion.
And what are you seeing as a normal? I mean, I know every project's different, right? So I don't want to hold you to anything specifically, but
Sure.
like, what are you seeing for let's just hypothetically say a $3,000 ground up or sorry, 3,000 square foot ground up construction as like a normal first gen, as you're calling them? What's the timeline from like permits to CO?
Yep. Yep. So I would say, once starting with design, actually, we're probably in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 months. And then once we actually put it into permit, that's kind of the unknown. But from a construction standpoint, on a ground up project like that, we can usually knock those out in 7 to 8 months.
So
If it's
three to
just
four on the
a
design, and then 7 to 8 on the, so kind of around 12 months ballpark is what you're telling
correct.
people. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
How quickly
And
can you? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just depending on the municipality, in some cases they're starving for new business, so we can knock those permits out in 30 to 60 days. And some other times it can be upwards of a year.
Yeah.
It's kind of all over the board. And that's probably the hardest thing to just, set the proper expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now if you kind of pivot into more of the leasehold, realm, Jason, how
Sure.
quickly are you guys able to turn something like that around? And do you
Yeah.
potentially deal with is permitting issues the same, right? Could you be a 12-month permitting issue on a leasehold, or is that a little bit different scenario just because you
No,
don't you're not
it's
looking at a raw piece of
definitely.
land?
Yes, definitely goes quicker. So I would say, permitting might be more in the neighborhood of like 30 to 90 days tops. And then once we actually start construction, we can usually knock those out in 10 to 14 weeks.
That's a
Wow.
pretty quick turnaround.
It's absolutely quicker, I think, and we can talk about this obviously as we get further into this. I mean, I think the first generation of lease space is a great place to start, but then obviously you do run into with the growth that we see in the veterinary industry is doctors outgrowing their space, and so that's something that we certainly try to guide them on that conversation if they're trying to decide between a lease space and a ground up project.
Yeah, how are you having those conversations? So, like, because you guys do renovations as well, right? So,
We do, yes.
if
So
someone
yeah.
already is in their facility and maybe it's the layout's not great and the composition they're not getting the most use out of their space and there's an opportunity for expansion, how are you guys like going through and helping the docs to understand what the ROI would be on these types of projects? Like, I'm sure you have to have data on this to say, hey, we add
Absolutely.
2 exam rooms here and you can expect blah. Like, I would assume that's the case. Is that how it works?
Very much so. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So, a lot of times, the general rule of thumb, and there's a little bit of a range here, is that per exam room, a doctor should be generating somewhere in the neighborhood of $650 to $750,000 annually per exam room. And so, when we run into a facility that might have 2,500 square feet, but only have maybe 2 or 3 exam rooms, that's when we have a conversation about shrinking areas like reception. Obviously we don't want to cut into their treatment space, but if it's just like inordinately bigger, in relation to the rest of the hospital, we can have a conversation about that. And then when we're doing, expansions or remodels of existing facility, if space allows, we have the flexibility of putting a trailer, which may not be ideal, but it still kind of keeps them operable while we're working on that space to either remodel or expand their existing facility.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. So you all coordinate all that for them.
We do. Yes, we just finished one in the Decatur area that turned out amazing. It was upwards of a 60-year-old facility, and it just layouts change over time, right? And the space that you need and kind of adequately. So I think we went from like 3 exam rooms to 6 or 7 there, and we were able to put them in a trailer in the back, behind the building, so that they could still be relatively, maybe not 100% operable to what they're normally used to, but it didn't slow them down. There were certain things that they still had to maybe send out, but they could still function as a wellness general practice for sure.
It's pretty crazy how some of that has evolved. And again, I think like another thing that really points out around the trailer, because I can remember, you know, talking with Mike, who's one of your partners, when he first started
Sure.
that, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
And it was like kind of cutting edge at that point in time, right? Because like renovations were not nearly as common. Can you talk a little bit about like the increase in number of renovations just because finding space and cost of property, especially, for those of us that are in like metro Atlanta? I mean, James, you and I were even talking about further out now, like the cost of land just makes that unviable.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And so I definitely think what we don't want to do, and the thing that we're always the most mindful of is parking, right? So we don't want it to be disruptive for the client experience. So if we have space, or on the back half of the facility where we can, put a trailer, I mean, that is ideal, for sure.
And now what do you have just kind of, because I mean I know people always like love metrics, right? Like what should I think about for this or what should I think about for this? Do you have like kind of a target like land cost that you find works? Because I'm assuming if the land become, I mean, anything can be built for any dollar amount, but at some point in time, like the project doesn't work. Is there a
Right.
land like cost that you ultimately like shoot to target for, Jason?
Yeah, so I think we're probably particularly mindful just because we were working with doctors oftentimes the second go around who had been in maybe 1,500 square feet to 2,000 square feet, and they were wedged between a dry cleaner and a Papa John's, and they just outgrew the space, and so they were worried about retention if I go up, 5 miles down the road or what have you. And so we came up with our Start Right program where ideally, if we could find a piece of dirt under $400,000, so not in downtown Atlanta or Charlotte by any stretch, but an up and coming area where a doctor, as a visionary, can kind of say, maybe this is not overly saturated with veterinary care at this point, but I can kind of see the forest through the trees here. And I feel like this is an up and coming area. So it kind of gives them a forever home in a freestanding ground up facility where instead of having maybe 2 or 3 exam rooms, in that smaller space, they could have 5 or 6 exam rooms, which allows them to hire, bring on additional doctors, additional support staff, and again, kind of serve as that forever home for the doctor.
Broader question on, I don't know if this is something you can answer, but like,
Sure.
What are you seeing in terms of startup like numbers? Like, are there more and more common now, or is it being less common than it was a few years ago? And then part two of that question, just so we can kind of get some education there, but like part two of that question is, when you're working with someone on a design build, and whether they're doing the Start Right program or others, and they're thinking like, hey, Jason, I want to start this practice, I want to grow it, and it's not going to be something I want to hold on to forever. I want to design it with the intent to make it as appealing as possible to a corporate group.
Right.
Is that something, like, just kind of talk about that a little bit if you could?
Yeah, so the first part of your question, absolutely. I think startups are just as high, at least in my 5 years being with Blue Frog, as they've been, any year prior that I was with the company. So I think that's very encouraging. And some of them, whether it's, they want that autonomy and maybe they've been an associate at a corporate practice and it just wasn't the right fit and they want the autonomy of kind of having, being a new business. I mean, that's great. So I definitely think that there is just as much appetite. Interest rates aside, I think there's just as much appetite to be a startup doctor and start your own practice today as there was any year prior.
Yeah.
I definitely think there is continually an appetite for that. And I don't see that changing. I really don't. I still feel like, obviously the 5 and 6 doctor practices, they're going to continue to be several of them out there. But I think it's very appealing to a doctor that could start out on their own and get this to 2, 3, 4 doctors. I definitely think that there is ongoing still a lot of appetite. Remind me the second part of your question. I apologize.
Yeah, it's just around like, if they are going to build with the intent to grow it and scale it and ultimately partner with a corporate group, are
Yep.
you able to advise them on the front end, just given y'all's experience? And I know you guys work with some corporates, right, on renovations and startups and such. So are you able to say like, hey, this is what they're looking for, this is what we want, this is going to make this the most appealing? Also, like, where's the value? Because some docs might want to overspend on certain areas that a corporate might not value as much. So like, are you
Yes.
guys able to help them navigate that and advise them there?
Absolutely. I think that's where we, going back to just a feather in our cap with the design team, is that we've been so used to kind of working with those startup doctors and knowing exactly, being mindful of maximizing that square footage. I think that has really helped us service the community well going forward, to say, I can appreciate how you want the big exam rooms or the even larger exam rooms. We can scale those back. They don't need to be much bigger than maybe like a 7x8 or, a 7x9, but like big waiting areas, staff break spaces. Those are nice to haves. But I mean, if it's going to potentially prevent them from having an additional 2 exam rooms at 650 to 750 a clip per exam room, that's substantial. That could be well into the 7 figures annually for that doctor. And then from an exit strategy, that number just gets, I mean, that could be well into 8 figures, leaving
Right.
that opportunity on the table by not maximizing that out on the front end. So we definitely try to think with the end in mind when we sit down with doctors and kind of help them plan that out.
Kind of along that line, Jason, like, how many clients have you worked with where it's a scenario that you help them in a leasehold space, got them into a 2,000 square foot leasehold space, got them started, and then 6, 7 years later, you're helping them move into that more like dream facility? And I mean, I think it's kind of a two-part question in my mind, right? Like, how do you manage upfront construction costs if that's somebody's kind of end in mind vision? And then how do you help them like execute on that plan? And what have you seen with past clients kind of come to fruition with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I definitely think, I can think of some examples in the Atlanta area where we were able to shoehorn, upwards of 6 exam rooms into 2,500 square feet, which seems, undoable on the surface. But when you really start to kind of peel that apple back a little bit for the doctor and kind of, walk them through that, it's like, okay, let's really, the goal is to not have them waiting in the waiting area for 30 minutes. The goal is to get that client into the room with their animal as quickly as possible, right? So that's where the majority of that space should be. And so I think as you kind of help them navigate, like, all right, this is traditionally how things have been. You've got these huge waiting areas, but the goal and the experience really starts in that exam room. And so I think focusing on that just kind of gets that mind shift in motion. And I think most doctors are very receptive to that, especially when you can put a pen to paper and say, not only is the experience better for the client and for the pet, but it's better for the bottom line too. So I definitely think doctors are very open to suggestions on, we want to take full advantage of, that income producing space in the exam rooms as opposed to your waiting areas or staff break rooms or some of those areas that just tie up a lot of space and just don't really contribute to the bottom line. So I think doctors are very open to those conversations. They just need a little bit of guidance, which is why we do our drive events and some of those other things to kind of help them, because it is a daunting task.
Yeah.
And you can't do it just with one group. You need a lender, you need a real estate partner, you need, you know, folks on the, equipment side to help them. It's really all encompassing.
Well, you jumped ahead to like one of the questions that I was really interested in is like who needs to be part of a successful construction team?
Sure.
Maybe expand upon that a little bit.
We will partner with industry folks such as somebody on the lending side, a real estate partner, somebody, whether it's like an IDEX or an Antex, somebody like that can help with that effort. A digital healthcare marketing firm like EOS, for many of those that may not be familiar, they kind of pinpoint and help navigate whether it's, pet owning population, a specific area, or, helping them identify an area that might be not overly saturated with veterinary care.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I love that. I had a kind of a couple things as you were talking about that I was thinking. One
Sure.
is an anecdotal experience that I had personally. My vet hospital, they changed the way that they collect payment from being at reception post appointment to the techs actually handling that in the exam rooms. Now we have technology that allows you to do that easily. Is that like best practices now? I just thought it was a little different because I had to take my Aussie in. He had an infection and we were back there. She shows me the options. We pay there so that they can like get me out. Like I'm out of there as soon as I pay.
Yes.
Like, you know what I mean? I don't have to go back and hang out in the lobby and with our dogs and their 80 pounders, other dogs coming in. Is that best practices now? Is it across the board?
I think so. No doubt. I think the standard of care goes up because recommendations are being made in the exam room, whether it's around like prevention for the animal or whatever the case may be. A lot of times by the time they get back to reception, they're just saying, oh, maybe I'll only buy a couple doses of heartworm or flea medication as opposed to walking out with like a year supply, which is the gold standard. We've got bugs galore down here. So, I mean, they need to be wary of, being on heartworm medication the entire year and flea and tick medication the entire year as well. And so, not to mention, it's just, what if the client is regretfully got an older pet who's going through a tough time and maybe their bill is really high. It's uncomfortable to have that conversation in earshot of other clients that are in that reception area. So I definitely think the standard of care goes up and ultimately the transaction average goes up by doing those in the exam room.
That's super helpful. And that was really just for me personally, but whoever's listening, that's cool too. The one thing too I wanted to discuss when you were talking about the team is just like if someone's going to go start a hospital and they're going out to bid the project and they're obviously going to work with more generalists who are not specialists like you guys, like, and they might be able to get a lower cost, for example. Like, how can you demonstrate to them the value add of working with a niche? And it's no different than what we do on the wealth management side. Like we believe we have a niche practice that can go in and add a ton of value based on, subject matter expertise and helping them understand exactly what's going to happen during their transitions. Like, how does it work for you guys to demonstrate that value add? I know you talked about it a lot today that we can pick up, but just specifically, Because I'm sure that's something you run into all the time, I would assume.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, our competition is probably like a brother-in-law or a home builder, what we're typically up against, right? And
Yeah.
so that's where we have conversations with doctors about like, what about things like hard pipe oxygen, your cages, things of that nature. There's so many intricacies that go into building the practice as opposed to just having plumbing and electrical and, heating and air running through the space. And so we definitely help doctors every day navigating that. We also have an employee who her role, she came from, 20 plus years of practice management experience. And so she's our practice integration specialist. And so she helps with a lot of the hand holding, especially for doctors that are going at this for the first time. So your startups, she'll help coordinating the equipment ordering and all of these other intricacies that go beyond just outfitting the practice. So it's very helpful for these doctors because it is such a daunting practice, process. Oftentimes, 90+% of these doctors are still working at a full time elsewhere. And so they don't have time to look over our shoulders every step of the way. And so it's comforting that we have those additional resources that we can offer to the doctor to say, hey, we'll help you with your equipment. We'll help you with this, that, and the other. And ultimately, maybe even save them a little bit of money too, which is hugely important for that doctor going at this for the first time. So we definitely think of ourselves as more than just a construction company. We really want to be an advocate and an asset to the client every step of the way.
No,
That's awesome. I love
I
it.
think that's great. Obviously, that insight, Jason, is so helpful, right? Like, I mean, I just from my lending days remember the challenges that are faced. Sometimes when you get somebody who draws the plans, not really spend a ton of time in a vet hospital, and then it actually comes to, finished product, and the client's like, wait, that really wasn't what I was thinking, or I hadn't thought about this issue that it creates because my patients are on four legs and pee in my facility, right? And so like
Yep,
I think there's just like so much value in that.
absolutely.
I got one final cool question. And I
Sure.
know we didn't talk about this before we kick it to Travis to kind of wrap us up. I thought it'd be kind of fun. What's like the most unusual or weird feature you've ever heard a hospital owner want? If you have anything like that, like something that's just like way, way out from what
Yeah.
you normally would recommend. Anything that comes to mind?
I would say one thing that we've implemented in several practices are we actually have like heated exam tables for like their cat only rooms. So that
Mm,
kind of is in line with fear free, and it's something that I think obviously it is an additional expense, but it really tends to bring a positive experience to the client to have their cat in there. There's kind of like they're fractious to begin with, right? They got the whole white coat syndrome going on in the exam room, and so we've actually installed heated exam tables for their cat only exam rooms, which it's been nice. It's not something that we landed on our own, but it was definitely driven by clients that were like, what if we did something like this? Kind of goes in line again with fear free. So that's been kind of cool to see happen. We've probably done that in a half a dozen or so around the Atlanta area.
my wife and mother-in-law, who are just cat fanatics and they do a lot of cat rescue. They're your cat people. Like if they went into an exam room and that was a feature, they would be there for life. Like that's something that they
Absolutely.
would never. They would be so stoked about that, and
Of course.
that's different strokes for different folks, I suppose.
That's right. Absolutely. But yes, those have been a real hit.
That's awesome.
No, that's awesome, Jason. Thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time to come sit down and share a little bit of information with all of our listeners. So we always kind of wrap things up with there's a quote that says everyone wants to change the world, but no one wants to change the toilet paper roll. And so every guest has had to answer the question, are you that person that sneaks out of the bathroom and leaves the empty toilet paper roll? Or maybe for you, has your wife, have you gotten in trouble enough with your wife that you no longer do that?
I guarantee you, if my wife was sitting next to me during this right now, she would be laughing to herself. I have been guilty of that before.
Attaboy.
Try not to be that guy, but I definitely have stubbed my toe a time or two in that area.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, again, I guess thanks for coming on, and after everyone answers that question, they get a chance to share their kind of one line on if someone wants to change the world, how should they go about changing the world?
I mean, I think it's just it's one bite of the elephant at a time, right? I mean, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So you just got to do it one bite at a time. So but yes, enjoy the process, enjoy the journey, and one step at a time.
Beautiful. I love it. Jason, thanks so much, man. So everyone, this was Jason Hills of Blue Frog. Jason, we appreciate you spending time with us today, man.
Likewise. Thank you both again. Enjoyed it and would love to be a part of it again in the future.
Absolutely. We'll have you back. See you, man.
Take care.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Vet Worthwhile podcast. You can find us online at signaturefd.com/signature-veterinary. And then our ask would be, if you found this episode valuable, just think of one friend or colleague that you think would enjoy the content and just please share. So thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Travis York is the owner of 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and a partner of Signature FD. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors is a veterinary consulting and strategic planning firm of which Signature FD has no involvement or ownership. James Yost is a partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD. Signature FD is an investment advisor registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and Signature FD are not affiliated. Mr. York provides all non-investment advisory services through 3-in-1 Vet Advisors. The opinions of the guests and the contents of this podcast are intended to be educational only and should not be relied upon as investment, tax, business, or planning advice. You should consult with a professional advisor prior to taking any course of action that may impact you or your business.